Welcome to the History Nerds United podcast. I'm your head nerd, Brendan. Thank you so much for being here. Today we have watchmaker and author Rebecca Struthers. Yes, if you had told me at the beginning of this podcast, when we started this whole thing, that one day I'd be interviewing a watchmaker, I would have said you are both crazy and silly. But here we are. Rebecca wrote this amazing book, Hands of Time, A Watchmaker's History. And listen, for those of you out there saying there's no way this is interesting, first of all, the book itself has a 4.23 rating on Goodreads with 310 ratings. That's phenomenal. I love the book. And then on top of that, Rebecca's awesome, and I had so much fun talking to her. So if you're still thinking maybe I'm just lying to you, well then I'm going to bring Rebecca on so you can hear how awesome she is. Let's do it. And here we are with author Rebecca Struthers, A Watchmaker's History. Dr. Rebecca Struthers, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
So there's so much to go over here. So you are a watchmaker, which is not, I don't know if people know this. I think they might. There aren't a ton of you, right?
No, not as many as they used to be. Yeah, it used to be a far more popular career, but there aren't as many now. You get more service technicians. So that's kind of like your mechanics who do the kind of run-of-the-mill stuff for bigger brands. But people who can make watches from scratch are quite a rare breed now.
Yeah, so rare. I was just wondering, can I buy a watch from you, or would I have to take out like bank loans to do so?
Well, this is a complicated question at the moment, actually, because we've just sold out of our build stock. So we're selling 10 watches basically over the next 10 years. So they take a year to make each. Yeah, they were sold out. And then now I don't know what they're going to do on the pre-owned market. Well, I hope for their owners.
Well, I did look on the website, and I saw it was in, the British currency. So I switched that over, and I can't afford it. But if you take really big IOUs, we might be able to have a longer discussion about that.
Cool.
Listen, there's a couple things that really stick out to me about how impressive you are. Number one, you work side by side with your husband every day, and you don't cover it in the book, but as far as I know, you have not stabbed each other yet. I think people would say that that's a huge thing to be able to do. How do you both do it?
I think luck, partly. We get on really, really well, actually. We hardly ever argue, which is fortunate. Yeah, I can't imagine not working with Craig, because we're opposite skill sets. We're both good at opposite things, meaning independently we're kind of all right at what we do, but together we come together to be very, very good at what we do. And yeah, I can't imagine working without him.
That's really impressive. The other thing is that you're the first person in the UK to earn a PhD in horology. So, I mean, let's just say it. What's horology? Because I think a couple of listeners might have a question. And can you tell me just kind of about that journey? How did you end up even doing that?
Sure, yeah. So horology is the study of time, which is about as grand as it gets, isn't it? But it generally refers to the study of watches and clocks. So that's both making them and also studying the history of them as well. And I got into it by accident. It wasn't some grand plan. I didn't even know it was a career until later in life. Yeah, I started studying jewelry and silversmithing, and they just happened to teach it on the same course in the same campus. And I developed this interest of creating really basic automata, really, really basic. So things that moved out of metal. Yeah, some of the horology students spotted my work and asked if I'd ever thought about it as a career, and thought, oh, that sounds interesting. And went and had a look around their workshop, and that was it. That was like the moment I discovered what I wanted to do with my life. And also discovered Craig, my other half. So he was one of those students. He was in his first year at the time.
And I think some people might hear that and say, oh, she's doing something super specific. She's got a PhD. I think a lot of people might say, like, oh, you must have just grown up rich and you get to pick and do whatever you want. But you talk about in the book, this was something you had to really work at, because you grew up in Birmingham, UK, right?
Yeah, Birmingham, UK. It's kind of like the UK equivalent of Detroit. So we had big automotive industry here, and a lot of that went through the 70s and 80s and 90s. And yeah, by the time I was growing up, there wasn't an awful lot left. I didn't grow up from the sort of background where I got to play with very expensive watches, to put it mildly. It was very out of character. And interestingly, like my parents aren't in this industry at all. I was raised by my dad. My dad was a house husband and my mum worked for the Inland Revenue, so for the tax office. So really, really different. And it wasn't until I started studying that I found out that my family generations beforehand had worked in the local area that I was working now in the jewellery and silversmithing trade. So yeah, button makers, glass blowers, silversmiths, but all of them working for other companies, which feels quite special now. So I'm the first person in my family to be able to put my own name on the thing I'm making, which is, yeah, that's really cool.
Any Americans that you run into and find out where you're from, how many Peaky Blinders questions do you get? I came up with like 6, but I'm not going to ask any.
Yeah, really, that's another random thing. I grew up with stories of the Peaky Blinders as a kid, like with my dad growing up in the area of Birmingham that he did. They still had a reputation. This was even in the 1950s, so they'd not been around for like 50 years before that, and they were like a boogeyman story for kids. So if my dad was misbehaving, my granddad didn't want him to go certain bits of town, they would be like, "Don't go there, the Peakies will get you." So yeah, the legend remained for a long time after they were gone, and now it's back again, like it's come full circle.
Now, before we jump into the book, because it's a little bit of a bio, it's a little bit about just kind of the history of time and how we look at it. But one question I really wanted to ask up front: all right, what is the coolest watch you have somewhere in the shop right now, and what makes it so cool to you?
Okay, in the shop, I mean, if it's not watch, I was thinking of things of like watches that I own, and they're the sort of ones that I like doing restoration jobs on. So I've got a really cool 1934 Rolex Egyptian case, it's called, because it's got stepped lugs. So the bit that holds the straps is shaped like the size of a pyramid. But that was really knackered when it came in, and I restored it. And that for me, I think I love things with a story to them. And being a watchmaker and restorer myself, it means that I have a really special chance to create my own kind of story with watches. For this, I got this for when my book was published. I treated myself and restored it, and now it's mine, and it's special, and it's that memory and something that I've kind of built up from not quite a bag of bits, but wasn't far off a bag of bits, and that's been alive since the 1930s, and now having another life in me. So stuff like that I find really cool.
I mean, what I found really cool is the first thing you say when you're becoming a watchmaker is the very first step is you make your own tools, right? Like what you're going to use, you have to create yourself. And I mean, that just sounds super cool. Like what does that look like? Does somebody give you a list, like here are the tools you need to make, or, you know, how much customization do you kind of do?
Yeah, so I was really, really lucky the point I went through training. So the jewelry and silversmithing course I did beforehand, the guy who trained me retired the year I finished the course, and he'd started his apprenticeship at 13 years old. So I had this incredible wealth of knowledge as a tutor in jewelry and silversmithing. And then when I went into watchmaking, none of these courses still exist in the same way either. I was so lucky. When I went into watchmaking, it was completely hands-on. There was some theory. We had theory exams, but you were straight in at the bench, figuring stuff out. And we spent pretty much the first year of the course making our tools, or starting off making our toolkit. First project was to make something we call a movement holder. And the movement is the name that we give the mechanism inside the watch. So when we take it out of the case to work on it, we have almost like a tiny, tiny precision vise that holds the movement in place and keeps it secure while we work on it, so we don't damage it and we don't have to handle it. And we had a project to make this out of brass, and we had to file it up by hand. So this is all like your basics of how to use piercing saws, how to use lathes, how to turn by hand, how to tap a screw thread, and how to file. And yeah, I think it was about 3 months of filing. So it really sorted out the people who were passionate about it or not. A few people drop out at that point of the course. So people sign up thinking they're working on watches, and you're just given a chunk of brass to file for the next 3 months. But it's a phenomenal way to learn, and the only way to learn really if you're going to go on to both restore watches and make them from scratch, because you need to make your own tools throughout. So we still make new tools on a weekly basis, sometimes more frequently. And we call them jigs. It's like the generic name for kind of a supporting tool to help you do another job. They're just jigs. You make a jig for that.
I would definitely suck at your job because I picture you almost like a bomb diffuser, like you see in the movies, where like everything you do has to be so steady, or something's gonna. I mean, nothing's gonna blow up, but something can get really screwed up, right?
Yeah, I mean, you've got to watch your caffeine intake. Yeah, it is very precise, but yeah, I love that. You kind of lose yourself into that little world. And maybe that's another part of the reason why Craig and I get on so well working together, is because you are so focused. So, I'm working on a movement today that, it's one of the smaller movements we work on, and it's smaller than your thumbnail. So you've got dozens and dozens of parts in this tiny little mechanism that would sit within your thumbnail. It is so all consuming that, yeah, Craig and I can go for hours and hours and hours and barely exchange words because you're just in this little world with the objects you're working on. But it's nice. It's escapism.
We're going to get back to the watchmaking, but especially the book. I love that there's these two pieces of it. But I will say, you didn't think you were going to be a watchmaker. Did you ever expect that you would write a book that would talk about both Rolexes and swatches?
Funnily enough, yeah, totally. As soon as I got into this field, you can't separate the one side of it from the other. So the whole history of horology is, and I'm sure like many different sort of engineering and technology subjects, it's a consistent evolution of one thing to the next. So everything connects in one way or another. And yeah, there's relationships between Rolex and Swatch, and watches made hundreds of years ago. The first watch is over 500 years old now. But you can follow through between technology and brands through centuries of time. It all connects to each other.
I don't know if I'm going to get you in trouble by asking you this question. I mean, are Rolexes worth it? Like, Rolexes are very expensive, right? But it seems, kind of more of maybe an ego thing or this or that. But as somebody who knows what goes into these things, are you allowed to actually answer this question? Are Rolexes actually worth it?
Yeah, well, as I just mentioned that I bought myself a vintage one that I've done for my present, and I have a couple of vintage ones. I don't have any modern ones. There is this mad statistic. I can't remember the exact figures, but it's something like 2/3 or 3/4 of the value of a Rolex in the shop, a modern one, is spent on marketing it. I mean, are they the most state-of-the-art, highest end, most precise, most perfect watch you could own? No. However, they are a marketing machine, and there are very few pretty much mass-produced modern watches where there are lines within their ranges that you can buy it new and sell it down the road somewhere else at a profit. I mean, that's just, in investment terms, they are a beast of a brand, and you can't knock that. So, I mean, it depends on what you're buying a watch for. If you're looking at, will it hold its value? Is this a good investment? Then yeah, Rolex, because they spend so much on marketing there, there's no such thing as a safe bet. If there was, I'd be a very wealthy woman now. But they are kind of up there, and yeah, what they've achieved as a company for what is basically a mass-produced watch, it is a very well-made watch, to be fair.
All right, so good. I don't think Rolex is going to have me canceled then. That's good. So let's jump to the history part of it. Now, you mentioned watches 500 years old, but I want to jump back. When we start talking about watches or clocks, what's really the first one if we were to really rewind time a lot?
It depends on how you define what timekeeper would be. So the very earliest timekeepers generally are more like things like calendars, and the earliest possible calendar that we've discovered so far is about 44,000 years old, and that's possibly a lunar calendar. But as you go through time and you get kind of the finer and finer breaking down of time throughout our day, you get things like water clocks, sundials. So clepsydra water clocks can be something as basic as an urn with a hole drilled in it, and it's just the amount of time it takes for the water to drain out, and that urn to empty is used to mark what you could call hours, for example. But again, that's not a mechanism. That's the kind of the tracking of something that is performing a natural phenomenon that we would do anyway, and using that to define duration. So if we think of clocks as something that are a mechanism, something human made, the first clock, I would argue, was invented by Su Song in China in 1088. And I'd say that even though it was water powered, it was operated by something we call an escapement, which is still used in all mechanical watches and clocks to this day. And an escapement is really, really important. So escapement is basically what controls the escape of release of power from whatever the power source is. That's what it's called, an escapement. And it checks and releases that power. So if you've got power through, in Susong's clock, it was a water wheel with buckets, and the buckets would fill and push the water wheel around. You need something to control how quickly that water wheel is turning, something that grabs and releases it at a regular rate. And that was the first escapement. So 1088 for something we still use to this day. And that was the moment in history that the world would have probably heard its first tick-tock, because the escapement's the bit that ticks as well. So yeah, that's coming up to 1,000 years.
Now, let's talk about what would be the first portable one, the one that we think, because I think a lot of people think, oh, your first watch was on your wrist. But generally, especially when they first started, they were a bit too big for that, right?
Yeah, so the first fully mechanical clocks, they appear slightly before watches, but they're kind of your big tower clocks, so your big churches and the sort of things you get in your town hall. So these big architectural pieces, and these gradually shrink down over the centuries to, firstly, we call them table clocks, which are very small clocks that you could have on your table or carry around from place to place, but you couldn't wear them on your body. The first watch, so something you can actually physically wear, which for me as a watchmaker is a really important point in our history, because that's when I get really interested in them, because they go from just being a scientific instrument, something to measure phenomenon outside our control. So obviously we've got no control over the rate that our Earth rotates on its axis or orbits the sun. We control the measurement of it, to something that is so personal. Something that we can use to send messages about ourselves, about how we want to be perceived by society, to show how educated we are, to show that we're aware of the latest in technology and science. And they become this incredibly personal thing. They become kind of an active participant in our history rather than just this inanimate bystander. And the first one of these watches, so something that's both a timekeeper and small enough to be worn on your body, that we know of to this date, was made in around 1505 by a chap called Peter Henlein in southern Germany. And that's not to say it's the first. There's records of what sound like early watches that come out of northern Italy as well, but none have survived, so we can't be sure. But Henlein's watch was called a pomander watch, which is like a little ball. It's about the size of a hen's egg, and it's ornately pierced. So it was they're named after the pomanders of incense that were worn at the time, because they were a little bit stinky back then. So we used to like wearing incense to fragrance our surroundings and ourselves. And watches kind of fitted in within that style. So you'd have worn it hung around your neck on a chain.
So they're personal, as you were just saying, but they're also expensive as hell, right? Like when we think of somebody on a TV show and it's old-timey and some guy pulls out a pocket watch, that's really a huge statement, and we don't realize it, do we?
Yeah, I mean, for hundreds of years after their advent, they were phenomenally expensive things. So this is where the watch's status symbol first begins. And we might think of that as a modern phenomenon. So like our celebrities posing with their wristwatches on the covers of glossy magazines. But when people start going around portrait galleries, looking at paintings, start looking out for watches, because it's remarkable how many, once you get your eye in for it, how many people were posing with their watches in the 16th and 17th centuries as well. So it's been done for centuries, of literally like a guy and here's my watch, and here's flashing it for the portrait painter for a very long time. Probably longer than the watch would have run for.
So now a bunch of rich people for hundreds of years were the only ones with watches. This is one of my favorite little facts. I need to hear you talk about this one. You're a poor person, middle class, lower class. You got to get up for work. You got to be on time, but you don't have a clock. Can you please tell me what a knocker-upper is?
Not what it sounds like. I mean, this is a wonderful story and profession that came out of industrial Britain originally. And this connects to, industrialization. So we went from working a more natural schedule to working factory time. So working on night shifts and changing kind of our relationship with when we were waking up and going to bed. And obviously, if you're working night shifts, you're working different times, you're going to need waking up. Yeah, if you can't afford not just any watch or clock, but an alarm clock. So that's something we call a complication. Anything that goes above telling the time is called a complication. And an alarm would have been more expensive. So what you could do instead was pay your neighborhood knocker-upper who would come and very lightly tap on your window, or they'd use pea shooters as well to shoot a little spitball of paper at your window to wake you up at whatever the time of your shift was. And knocker-uppers would go around the whole neighborhood offering their services. So it was quite a knack to be able to knock lightly enough that they wouldn't wake up the neighbors and provide the services for free. And also not knock hard enough to put your window through. But this went right the way on until the Second World War.
Which at that point too, before we jump to the Second World War, because there was a really interesting fact that you have in here. But before we get there, watches do start becoming easier to come by, a little bit cheaper and everything like that. What changes in watchmaking that starts to make them more affordable than they would have been?
It all begins with mass production. So in the days of Peter Henlein, watches were something that would take someone a huge amount of time to learn how to make. So a traditional watchmaking apprenticeship was 7 years with another 2-3 years as a journeyman. So you're talking 10 years just to pick up the skills to make a watch. And then they could take you a very long time to make. So there was no cheap and effective way of making watches. It was all the expensive, slow way. Actually, this was a subject that ended up becoming my PhD because I became that obsessed with it. It was a new kind of watch, and incredibly one of the few areas of the Industrial Revolution where Britain lagged behind the continent was the beginning of the mass production of watches. And this initially started through the 18th century of just bringing your workforce in-house. So traditionally, watchmakers would work with a very small team in-house and then outsource things like making the springs, making the screws, making the cases, making the dials. They'd have kind of a creative community in the local area of people they'd work with. And the first, they call it a tablissage, which originated around the Swiss-French border, was this process of just one merchant running the whole thing rather than a watchmaker, and bringing all these skilled craftspeople under one roof and creating a production line. And that was the advent of non-standardized mass production. And from there, you go from, at the time, London was the center of all the famous watchmakers, and they could make maybe a few thousand watches a year, to, in these Swiss manufacturers, making 40, 50,000 watches a year plus. So that was a huge leap, but still nothing by modern mass manufacturing standards. So that was the following century, in the 19th century, in the US, was where the perfection of mass-produced standardized watches. So that was where you could make the movement, the mechanism in the US, and the case in Birmingham. Sometimes a company called Denison in Birmingham would make watch cases. So you can make the most of price comparison. So if the gold's really cheap here, you can make parts here or there, or whatever you need to make the most of any kind of the economic climate of each country, and switch around parts. And that was the moment watches go from being a few £100 to even cheaper, until you get to the end of the 19th century and Ingersoll introduced the dollar watch, which at the point that was released was the average day's wages for a US worker was $1 a day. And that was the point that watches truly became accessible to all.
And the start of this is definitely, you can tell how much you nerd out in the book about this one, because they're called fakes, right? They were called fakes. But, they were working watches and everything. And a lot of people are like, well, they're this and that. Like, but you're like, this is the coolest thing ever. You love this.
Yeah, I love it. They're the real underdog of the 18th century scene for watchmaking. Because we talk a lot about longitude and John Harrison. And this is like the quest for navigating the sea safely. Obviously, they've made TV series and movies and stuff about that. And at the same time, that's the really expensive high-end stuff. And for me, my interest is, how does that relate to people on the ground? Like, how is that affecting people's daily lives? If something is that expensive that hardly anyone can get one, then is it really that revolutionary? And this is kind of the underdog story that runs underneath that, is you have the accuracy quest that it's the big, shiny, glamorous thing. And you have the forgers as the undercurrent. They're actually bringing down the prices to make them accessible to all. So by the time you get very accurate watches, you've also got very affordable watches, and the two come together. Again, end of the 19th century, when Joshua Slocum circumnavigated the globe, became the first person to circumnavigate the globe. He did it with a $10 tin clock, not a marine chronometer. And Dutch forgeries, as they're called, were part of that. So this is like, I take you through from finding my first forgery signed by a guy called John Wilter. And I looked him up in our dictionary of watchmakers and it just said Wilter John, perhaps a fictitious name. That was it. And I dug and I could find out hardly anything about these watches. And yeah, I just became obsessed. I had to find out. My master's thesis was literally just called "Who was John Wilter?" ? Literal obsession. I'm 15 years in now and I'm still hunting. I'm pretty close. Yeah, 250 years back in time, hunting down the makers of these forges to understand how the democratization of time truly began, or democratization of our personal idea of time. Yeah, they were revolutionary. They transformed our relationship with something that used to be so expensive and seen as it'll never catch on as being cheap, which part of the reason the English industry met its demise is we refused to modernize. We refused to embrace these faster production methods. And yeah, by the time the US were completely machine making watches as well, so doing mass production and machine production, cutting out as many watchmakers, we were just left behind in the dust because we thought it would never catch on. Much like they thought wristwatches would never catch on.
Oh, it's the first time the British thought too much of themselves and things went wrong. Okay, I'm going to take
I know. Who'd have thought it?
Crazy, right? I mean, I love history. It's the first time I've ever seen it.
Yeah, no precedent for that.
This part, it kind of blew my mind because I just didn't think about it, right? Because we're talking about, we still don't have watches. We've talked about the history. The watches still aren't ubiquitous on the wrist yet. And you kind of dive into this, that the world wars is kind of what pushed the watches to go from holding it somewhere to on your wrist. And also, it was a hard sell because at first, watches on your wrist were seen as very feminine, right? And it had to get sold to men who were like, oh, I won't wear that. Only women wear watches on their wrists, right?
Yeah. So wristwatch, the first wristwatch possibly might have belonged to Elizabeth I. It's described in an inventory of her wardrobe. So back in the 16th century now, it was described as a clock worn on the arm. So that sounds pretty watchy to me. But they were very much items of jewelry. So they were treated as women's fashion accessories. And although women will wear pocket watches too, either worn around the neck, like the headline watch would have been, or suspended from your waistband, so you'd wear it on your hip. Wristwatches were pretty much just women, so it was seen as effeminate to wear a wristwatch. And this didn't really change until the kind of seedling of it started towards the end of the 19th century with the Boer Wars, and is linked with something called sweethearts watches. So this was the tradition or fashion for women to gift their husband, their lover, as he'd leave for war, their little silver fob watch that was very fashionable for women to wear at the time, with the promise that he'd return it safely when he came back from war. And the soldiers would start creating these little leather cup strap conversions to strap the watches to their wrists to keep them safe. And through doing that, they started to realize that actually, it's pretty handy having the time on your wrist instead of trying to find it in your pocket whilst being shot at. So, that planted the seed, but still it took a few more years after that before it caught on in a big way. And it wasn't until the First World War where obviously it was a much larger war that affected the whole world. And that kind of pushed men into getting used to wearing wristwatches. The first commercial wristwatches for men were called trench watches after their use in trench warfare. And you go from before the war, where hardly any men were wearing watches, certainly not if they weren't serving in the military, to the end of the war, and virtually every man owns a wristwatch. So it's incredible how quickly that changes from Elizabeth I through to the First World War, and it completely transforming.
Well, especially like World War I and, World War II specifically, a complication, and not necessarily a watch complication, but a real life complication is a lot of people collect watches, and what you'll run into in your own job is you're going to come across watches that owned by Nazis, owned by not so nice people, and you have collectors and stuff like that. How do you look at it, right? When that comes in and somebody says, hey, I want to do this and that, is it just, this is just another job? I just kind of go through and do it. How do you look at it when you see these types of watches?
Yeah, see, this is one area that Craig and I take quite a different approach on it. I am more emotive with it than he is. For his mindset of it is it's just an object. So when it comes to working on them in the workshop, it is just an object. And you don't know the history of that object, in that kind of even with the Nazi watches, they could have ended up being to a low-ranking an office worker or left in stores and never been used. And equally, you could have any watch coming on your bench that could have seen any number of horrors. And unless you know the history of it, you just never know. So if you let yourself be haunted about the history of an object that we have no way of understanding, then you just can't do your job. And I do see that side of it. At the same time, I just can't, I really struggle. And we don't have that many, thankfully, that we see. And the collectors that we have had are just people with an interest in 20th century history. Like, there's no sinister side to them at all. They just see it as an object and part of our history, and something that, for obvious reasons, it's important we remember what happened. But I won't work on them. I don't like them. They give me the heebie-jeebies. Not at all. I don't, I don't, nah. Ugh.
Well, let's jump to the completely other side of it. We already mentioned it. The swatch, something else that you also clearly love. You know what? And I hate to say this out loud. I think we got to explain what the swatch is. There may be people listening. I do know sometimes we get metrics and it says that people below the age of 30 will listen to the podcast. Can you please tell everyone what a swatch is?
Yeah, well, swatches are your cheap and cheerful plastic battery watches, quartz watches. And they came about during the 80s. So this was like towards the end of something we call the quartz crisis in the watch industry. And this is where battery watches really took on. And it was thought that it was going to be the death of mechanical watchmaking. And this timed in with like a series of financial issues and currency clashes and stuff with the Swiss industry too. So there were a lot of struggling traditional mechanical Swiss watchmakers when this guy called Nicholas Hayek came up with the idea for making these cheap and cheerful plastic, colourful plastic watches, pretty disposable. And it went really well. And he ended up, in short, buying in up a load of the failing Swiss traditional brands to form what we call the Swatch Group now. And this is still one of the largest kind of watch luxury groups on the planet. So that went really well.
They're so damn ugly, though. I mean, especially for you, you get to see these pieces of art that you're doing this, you're doing that, and then there's the swatch. But again, I got to give it to you. It's clear you're like, you love it for the history, for what it is, but yeah, anybody who's never seen one, they're absolutely hideous, in my opinion.
Oh, I think they're pretty cool. Although my big one is I'm a massive Casio fan. I love my Casios. I think it's because it's the antithesis of what I do as a day job. There's just something really reassuring about just knowing the watch you're wearing is just going to work. Like, literally, you can drop it off the top of a block of flats and it will work. That's wonderful. I never have to worry about my own watch.
Now, I think it was the Casio, right? That there was a few versions where it was also a calculator at the same time. Am I making that?
Yeah. I love the vintage ones, the vintage ranges. Yeah, you've got calculators, you've got music stuff. You got loads. They're really cool. Not that I'm biased.
It doesn't seem to be biased because, again, if you can like a Rolex and a swatch at the same time, it's just come one, come all. You're going to love the watch.
Yeah.
Except Nazi watches. Screw those guys.
Yeah, none of that.
Is there anything, as you're doing your research, I know you know a lot about it, right? You love this stuff. Was there anything as you were researching that really jumped out at you? Like, I had no idea about this until you started researching for the book.
Yeah, I mean, the earliest stuff is where I learned the most. So I do go back quite a long way. So 44,000 years before. We started with mechanical timkeepers. As soon as we get into mechanical timkeepers, that's my comfort zone. Like, I know that bit well. But that earlier bits and my personal areas of interest that I discovered were particularly relating to animals and how animals tell the time. So this is really important from human history as well, because animals are much better timekeepers than we are. If you look at like migration and things like that. So for tracking migratory animals and observing what the animals around us were doing would have been a wonderful way for us to start tracking the progression of the year. But I got lost down a bit of a rabbit hole because I love animals. I've got a rescue dog, 2 cats and 2 mice. And yeah, they fascinate me. So learning a bit more about how my dog, Archie, tells the time with his nose, that was fascinating. So dogs can smell the passage of time. If they were going to do anything, it was going to be with their nose, wasn't it? Because they are super sniffers. But dogs can use us as effectively like a human egg timer, smell egg timer. So if you have a regular working day, you might have noticed that your dog has an eerie ability to sense when you're coming home. And what they think is actually happening is that when you leave the front door, you leave your smell and you shut that behind you, and the smell will diminish over the course of the day. And the dog will learn when your smell has dropped to a certain level, that's the moment you walk through the front door again. And they can also smell the circulation of air around the room, which changes pretty consistently over the course of the day. And the theory is that this has evolved from wolf mums and their cubs, from being able to sense how long they've been apart from each other. So when mum needs to go back to feed her cubs, she can smell how much the cubs on her has diminished and head back to the den. So it's pretty cool. That
we don't deserve
I
dogs.
love stuff like that.
We don't.
No, we don't. And bees get jet lag.
Bees get jet lag.
Yeah. So when studying how bees tell the time, they're incredibly good navigators. Obviously, they travel long distances, finding flowers and always heading back to the hive. A study on a colony of bees in Paris, they had a theory that perhaps it's to do with the sun's light or position of the sun, that they were using this. And they moved the bee colony down into a cave. And they would still respond at the same time. So they started feeding them at the same time of day, and the bees would come out at exactly the right time to be fed. Then they tried moving the colony of bees from Paris to New York on a plane, so jet-setting bees, a very spoilt hive of bees. So they took the bees to New York and they started turning up to be fed at a 5-hour time difference.
Well, listen, we're getting along great, but it's time for me to fight with you, okay? And I've already pointed this out. I let you know this was coming. On page 80 of your book, you say watchmakers are not necessarily considered cool. First of all, I want to just completely argue with you on that. I think it's super cool to love something this much that you dedicate your life to it. And again, I would suck at it just trying to do all of that stuff really, really long time. So will you accept the fact that you are wrong in your book and that you are actually cool?
I'll agree that it's cool to be able to dedicate your life to something you're so passionate about, but I'm still a massive nerd. So.
Listen, that's what we do here, okay? You're in a safe place. And I will say this too. My review of the book, it'll go up before this. Like, I love the book. I definitely think I could have gotten 50 more pages on just you and your journey. Because, I mean, you do it here, but you drop it in here and there. I'm sitting there, I'm like, I could get 50 more pages of Rebecca's journey on this. So my argument has been made. It was the only ding I gave the book, right? So if anybody's asking, are you going to be happy at the end of it? That's the worst thing I could possibly say about it, was I needed more.
Oh, thank you. But yeah, editing was a brutal process. There's probably about 3 times this book on my laptop. Maybe the next round. Maybe I have to do another.
The next round, I think you can spend some more time on dog and bees.
Yeah.
Right? We can do a little bit of both, and then just a bit more of the journey. I mean, listen, it's basically already written. We just need to transcribe this, and I think we're there. So last question. Everybody gets it. Now, listen, we have definitely established that both you and I are nerds, right? You with watchmaking, us both with history. I mean, this is a history book right here. There are people out there who say, I don't read history. History is boring. Now, you and I both know these people are just plain wrong. But if I sat one of those people in front of you and they looked at you and said, history is boring, why should I read Hands of Time? What would you say to them?
Because it's not just history, it's time. And time is something that affects us all. I mean, how many of us can even answer the question, what is time? And yet we're living to it, living our lives to it every day, and have been for thousands and thousands of years. And don't you want to know why we do that? I suppose that was another big kind of learning thing for me in the book, is things like, did you know that we can change our experience of how long we experience time? So we can change our memories, our experience of our memories and the duration of them. So you can effectively distort your own memories to have a longer, more fulfilled feeling of life by understanding our relationship with time. And isn't that important? That's not just history, that's us now.
And what I would say is that's pretty damn cool.
I think so. Yeah.
Rebecca, the book's fantastic. Thank you so much for coming on.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. Lovely meeting you.
And that's it for this episode. Rebecca, thank you so much for coming on. Hands of Time, A Watchmaker's History. Trust me, right? Holidays are coming up. This is a gift for somebody, and they're going to say, this was awesome. Hit us up, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, send us emails, leave us 5-star ratings on whatever you're listening to this podcast on. We'd appreciate it. Consider it a Christmas present. Until next time, stay cool, nerds.